Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Naturally Speaking with Dr. Wendy Bohon. And we're going to get started in just a few minutes to allow people some time to trickle in after work. So go ahead and grab a glass of water, get a snack, and pet your animals, get some slippers on, get cozy, and we'll get started about 3 minutes after. Hi, welcome. If you're just joining us, this is Naturally Speaking with Dr. Wendy Bohon. We're going to get started in about 2 more minutes, so go ahead and grab what you need to be comfortable, and we'll see you back here in about 2. Hi, welcome. We're just about to get started with Naturally Speaking with Dr. Wendy Bohon. So really quickly, get comfortable, grab a glass of water, and we're going to get started in about 30 seconds. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sam Wins. I'm a conservation biologist and science educator with the National Park Service at Cabrillo National Monument. And with me today is our special guest speaker, Dr. Wendy Bohon. Before I turn it over to Wendy, we do have a housekeeping slide here. A couple of rules here. This is a webinar format, so don't panic if you can't see other participants. You're just going to see the hosts and the panelists. To ask questions, there's this really great thing called the Q&A function. So you'll see a little Q&A button. You'll click on that, and that'll queue up your questions, which I will read off to Wendy at the end. All right, so you can ask questions anytime so that you don't forget them, and then they'll get queued up and I'll read them in order at the end. If she's feeling it, she might stop periodically to answer questions, and she might also ask you some questions, which you can type your answers into the chat, okay? Please keep your mic muted. There's a handful of you on this Zoom webinar, and it can get kind of chaotic, so you're gonna stay muted today. And if you need them, closed captions are available with the CC icon either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what version of Zoom you're using. And without further ado, I'm going to stop my share because I'm going to pass it over to our special guest speaker. We have with us an amazing earthquake geologist, Dr. Wendy Bohon today, good friend of mine, IFTHEN ambassador, incredible science communicator, and you're in for a real treat. Wendy, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate the introduction and the kind words, and I appreciate all of you for being here today. Hold on. It's been a minute since I used Zoom. I work for the state now, and so I get confused between all of the different platforms I have to use. Sharing and entire screen. Is that the one I want, Sam? I think.
I think
And
so, unless you have notes somewhere. There you go. You can see your entire screen.
I don't use notes.
Perfect.
We're just going to roll with it, you guys, okay? So I am excited to talk to you today about one of my favorite things. But first, let's set the scene. We want to start the story at the beginning. So we're talking today about California, known across the world for iconic cities, beautiful coastlines, unique ecosystems, incredible mountains, and of course, world famous beaches. We're also known for something else, earthquakes. And that reputation, we earned that. So these are the earthquakes that have happened in California today. The ones that are red are the ones that have happened in the last hour, and the ones that are orange have happened in the preceding 23 hours. Here's the earthquakes from the past week. We had 73 earthquakes last week, and here are the earthquakes from the past month. So lots and lots of earthquakes happening in California all the time. And so let's zoom out a little bit. Here's the USGS map showing the chance of damaging earthquake shaking in the next 100 years. So areas that are in red and warmer colors are the areas that have higher chances of earthquake shaking. And you can see that California has the lion's share of that risk. But why? It's because we sit on the boundary of two tectonic plates. So we're going to zoom out again. We're going to look at the whole world. The surface of the Earth is covered by a thin skin of rock called the crust. And that's broken up into these big pieces that are moving around really slowly over the surface. And the places where those plates, those tectonic plates come together are the places where we have the most earthquakes. We here in California sit on the boundary between the North American plate and the Pacific plate. And so let's look a little more closely at that boundary. Let's start down here in the Gulf of California. So down there, the crust is actually splitting open. This is called a divergent boundary. So the Gulf of California is getting a little bit wider all the time. Once you start to move up into the border between California and Mexico, right in here around the Salton Sea, that's when you're getting into a different kind of motion. In this area, the plates are sliding past each other in a strike slip or transform boundary. And that boundary continues all the way up California until you get to about Point Arena. And then it changes again. Then we introduce a new plate, the Juan de Fuca plate. And that plate is colliding with the North American plate, and it's diving down underneath it in a subduction zone. So we have a divergent boundary, a transform boundary, and then that convergent boundary. And while that's not complicated enough, that's actually the simplified version. So let's dive a little deeper. Let's look at the map on the right-hand side, the tectonic motions of the Western United States. So this is a map showing the location of GPS or GNSS stations. And you can see an example of that in the picture up at the top. So all of those little arrows, if you look at the end of the arrow, there's a black dot. And that black dot is showing you the location of that instrument that's measuring the motion of the crust, measuring how the ground is moving. And so the direction of the arrow is showing you the direction that the ground is moving, and the length of the arrow is showing you how quickly it's moving, okay? What I want you to pay close attention to is how that's changing as we look across California. So if we look in Eastern California near Arizona, you can see that the arrows are short. And as we move west towards the coast, they get longer and longer and longer. So imagine you're on roller skates, right? And one of your roller skates is going really slow and the other one is going really fast. There's going to be a difference in the middle, right? That difference in the motion causes stress and strain to build up, and it causes the rocks to crack. And that leads to a whole network of faults across California because of this plate motion. Okay, so these are all faults in California. We have thousands and thousands of faults, and hundreds of those faults are active. So let's zoom in to Southern California. We're going to zoom into that area in the yellow box. So this is a map from the California Geological Survey showing faults in Southern California, and we're going to talk about some of the most important faults. So let's start over on the west. The fault that I've outlined right here is called the Newport-Inglewood Rose Canyon Fault System. So up near Los Angeles at the northern part of this fault system, that's the Newport-Inglewood part of the fault. And then as you move down and towards the San Diego area, that's the Rose Canyon part of the fault. And you can see that different pieces of the fault are different colors. Those are different segments. And so those segments can operate independently of each other, or you can have an earthquake that breaks all of those segments at one time. And so when we think about how big an earthquake is, that's partially dependent on the length of the fault that ruptures. So if just a little piece of the fault ruptures, that would be a smaller earthquake. So if this whole fault system were to rupture, it could be up to a magnitude 7.4 earthquake. So we know that parts of this fault have ruptured in the past. We think the last earthquake that happened here in the San Diego area on this fault system happened in about 1862. So let's keep moving to the east. This is the next important fault system. This is the Elsinore fault zone, okay? All of these faults are right lateral strike slip faults. That means that the side where the ocean is moving up towards Alaska, okay? And so if you imagine looking across the fault, it'll look like everything is moved to the right. So the Elsinore fault could have earthquakes of magnitude 6.5 to 7.5. The length of that fault's 180 kilometers, probably a little bit more. The northern part of that fault ruptured in 1910 in a magnitude 6 earthquake, and there was actually a pretty big earthquake, a magnitude 7, on the southern part of that fault in 1892. Now, the Elsinore fault's really interesting because it's a very quiet fault. There's not a lot of earthquakes that happen on that fault or even nearby. So it was a little bit unusual when there was an earthquake in San Diego last week that was very close to the Elsinore fault. So let's talk a little bit about that earthquake and tell me in the chat if you felt shaking from that event. So this was a magnitude 5.2 earthquake, 5 kilometers south of Julian, California. So you can see that little dot, that blue dot. That is the epicenter of the earthquake, the point on the surface above where the earthquake starts. And then the red line that you can see near there, that's the Elsinore fault. Now this caused there to be shaking across the region. This is a map showing the instrumentally generated amount of shaking across the area. So the colors represent different levels of shaking. Cooler colors are less shaking, warmer colors are more shaking. Those other little circles that you see, that's past seismicity in our historical database. And you can see there's not a lot around where this earthquake occurred, and it was widely felt. This is a map showing places where people experienced earthquake shaking. And then again, the color tells you what level of shaking they experienced. So that was an earthquake that was near the Elsinore fault zone. Moving to the east, the next set of faults we're looking at is called the San Jacinto fault zone. Again, a right lateral strike slip fault could have earthquakes magnitude 6.5 to 7.5. And the time between earthquakes on this fault is sometime between 100 years and 300 years, depending on the fault segment or section that we're talking about. This is one of the most active faults in Southern California. There have been quite a few magnitude 6 earthquakes on this fault in historic times, including a magnitude 6.5 in 1968 and a magnitude 6 in 1987. Continuing to the east, this is the big guy, right? This is the San Andreas fault zone. This fault is more than 1,200 kilometers long. So it starts at Bombay Beach in the Salton Sea, runs up most of the length of California until Point Arena when it goes offshore. But there's a section in the middle near Parkfield. If anybody's ever been driving in the Carrizo Plain, not many people have unless you're a geologist. Beautiful, highly recommend. But that area is really interesting because that part of the San Andreas Fault has earthquakes on average every 22 years. There's about a magnitude 6 there. So we're going to measure from that point in Parkfield and just think about the southern part of the San Andreas that would impact here in San Diego, right? So it's about 550 kilometers from Parkfield to the Salton Sea. And that part of the fault has had earthquakes as well. There was an earthquake in 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake. There was an earthquake in 1812, but this very southern section of the fault that I've outlined here has not had an earthquake since the mid-1700s. All of these faults, if we think about the earthquakes they could generate and the shaking that that would cause, we've created a map that shows the earthquake shaking potential for California. So that's not just the San Diego area faults, right? That's all of the faults that we know about that are active in the California area. The thing I want you to notice on this map is that it doesn't go from no shaking to lots of shaking. The scale here starts at strong shaking. So that's shaking strong enough to cause damage, and it goes to devastating shaking close to the active fault zones. But where does the shaking actually come from? Have you ever thought about what we're feeling when we feel earthquake shaking? That's kind of an interesting question, right? So as we have the tectonic plates moving, stress and strain is building up inside of the rocks. Eventually, that stress and strain is going to overcome the strength of the rocks, and they're going to break. And when they break, they send out energy waves in all directions that we feel as shaking. So that's the earthquake. And what is that shaking like? What can it cause? Is this what we're looking at around here? We're going to see giant blocks of rock and buildings falling over. Thankfully, the rock is a better actor than he is scientist, and this is not what we can expect. So what can we actually expect? Let's look at some examples of places that have had really large earthquakes. So the anniversary of this earthquake I'm about to show you is coming up on April 25th. This was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake in Nepal. What we're going to look at is some CCTV footage from Kathmandu. And I want you to pay attention to the white square that you see. So that's an overlay of a nearby GPS instrument, and that will show you how the ground was moving. And you can see that motion reflected in the people that are on the ground. Here we go. So now remember, earthquakes don't just shake the ground up and down. They also shake it side to side and in all directions. So it can be really hard to maintain your footing when there's strong shaking. This next video is from Sendai, Japan. And this was taken during the magnitude 9.2 Tohoku-oki earthquake that occurred in 2011. So larger earthquakes create more shaking, but they also last for a longer period of time. Shaking from this earthquake continued for more than 6 minutes. When we think of ground shaking and the damage it can cause, we usually think about the damage to infrastructure, right? How it can affect things like homes, buildings, bridges, dams, and other critical infrastructure. But there's other secondary effects that can be really devastating after earthquakes that we also need to plan for. For instance, fire. So there was an earthquake along the northern San Andreas Fault in 1906 called the Great San Francisco Earthquake that was devastating to the city. But the earthquake itself was not as devastating as the fires that followed. So the map over on the left is showing the 3-day progression of the fires that followed that earthquake. Now imagine you're having fires that are starting all over the place. You don't have water. The pipelines that bring in the water have also been broken, which makes it harder to fight the fires. And so often they will burn and spread unchecked. If you look at the top picture, that's an image showing the fires as they were burning the city. And on the bottom is an oil painting titled The San Francisco Fire that's showing ships fleeing the harbor with the city burning in the background. Earthquake shaking can also cause secondary effects. One of those is liquefaction. And if I'm honest with you, I'm a child of the 80s, right? And so I really thought liquefaction was going to feature in my life a lot as a problem. This is the only time that it's ever really a thing, at least for me. So when you have areas that have soft, sandy soil and a high water table, and then you introduce seismic shaking into the mix, what happens is that you can create almost like a quicksand for the duration of that shaking and for a little while afterwards. The shaking pushes the water up towards the surface, which pushes all the grains of sand apart. That increases the pore pressure. That causes the surface of the ground to lose strength. And then houses, cars, things that are heavy that are on top of the soil can actually sink in. It can also cause spreading, it can cause fissuring, and it can cause things like sand blows. We saw a lot of that after the earthquake in Myanmar. Additionally, earthquakes can cause earthquake-induced landslides. This happens when the strength of a hill slope is overcome by the forces of gravity plus the earthquake shaking. And so for this to happen, it requires steep slope, weak geologic materials, and moderate to strong ground shaking. Usually it has to be an earthquake of magnitude 5.5 or greater to induce landslides like this. This image is from the Pacific Palisades after the Northridge earthquake in 1994. And that earthquake caused thousands of landslides around the Los Angeles area. Certain earthquakes can also cause tsunami. So most often tsunamis happen when an earthquake occurs on the ocean floor, but it has to be an earthquake that moves up the seafloor. Because when you move up the seafloor, you also displace or move all of the water above that. All of that water then flows out in all directions, and that is the tsunami. So this is damage to Japan after that magnitude 9.2 Tohoku Oki earthquake. But tsunamis don't stay in place. They can travel and actually have global impact. So this is a map showing the tsunami wave height from that same earthquake. And if you follow some of those lines across the Pacific Basin, you can actually see that they impact California. And indeed, California had more than $100 million worth of damages up and down its coast. This is that tsunami in the Santa Cruz Harbor, $28 million of damage just in Santa Cruz. So since 1800, there have been about 150 tsunamis that have impacted coastal California, with about a dozen of those causing significant damages or fatalities. So that's the problem. We've outlined what the issues are. So what can we do? The first thing we have to realize is that there's no such thing as a natural hazard. What we have are natural hazards like earthquakes that overlap with our vulnerable human systems, and that creates the risk of a disaster. Now, there's nothing we can do about earthquakes. That's just the earth doing its earth things. What we do have control over is the vulnerability of our systems. And so what we want to do is figure out ways that we can learn to live with earthquakes. How can we mitigate earthquakes and make our communities, make our cities, make our infrastructure more resilient to earthquakes and their effects? We have to do that before the earthquake happens, right? Because once it's started, it's too late. But unfortunately, we tend to learn geology the morning after the earthquake. So now I'm going to tell you some of the stories that have actually driven us to make changes before the next earthquake happens to improve our seismic resilience in California. So let's go back in time, okay? It's 1933. It's a Friday in March. The weather is nice. Kids are home from school, riding their bikes. Parents are home from work. People are making dinner. I imagine people are out taking walks, enjoying the spring weather. We're down in Southern California. The weather is great. It's Long Beach. When suddenly there was a magnitude 6.4 earthquake on the Newport-Inglewood Fault. That's that strike-slip fault that slides, right? It caused 123 deaths and about $50 million in damage, which is about $1 billion in 2024 dollars, okay? I can only imagine what it was like to walk around and see the devastation that followed, especially when people started to realize and recognize what buildings had been really impacted. Schools. More than 70 schools were completely destroyed and 120 others were heavily damaged by the earthquake shaking. Imagine if that earthquake had happened 5 hours earlier when students and educators were in these buildings. I don't want to think about it. And it turns out that the California legislature didn't want to think about it either. A month after this earthquake, the Field Act was passed, and that regulates the design and construction of public school buildings to ensure their seismic safety. And since the Field Act was passed, not a single student or educator has died from an earthquake in a California public school. Now, at the California Geological Survey, we have a small part in ensuring that this continues. All new public school buildings and different school projects must submit a geologic investigation report for CGS to review to make sure that it meets the seismic safety codes that we have in the state. But it's California, you guys, another day, another earthquake. So we're going to stay in Southern California for now, but we're going to fast forward to 1971, San Fernando. It's the winter time now. It's a Tuesday. Everybody's getting up for work at 6 o'clock in the morning, just starting to make breakfast. People are smelling the coffee. And then a magnitude 6.6 earthquake occurs on the Sierra Madre Fault. This earthquake was a little bit different. It still caused damages, 64 deaths, $500 million in damages. But this earthquake actually broke the surface of the earth, which didn't happen during the Long Beach earthquake. And so the types of damage that we saw from it rupturing all the way up to the surface, as well as the types of buildings that were impacted, made this a very significant earthquake. So a lot of hospitals or some of the hospitals in the area were very damaged. And so this led to the passing of the Hospital Safety Act, very much like the Field Act, to ensure that hospitals have higher safety requirements for earthquakes, because hospitals are a nexus for recovery after these types of events. The surface rupture, where the earthquake broke the surface of the ground, and you can see it here in this house that's sort of been torn apart. That led people to really think about what happens when faults break the surface of the earth and how we can prevent this type of damage in the future. And so the following year, the Alquist-Priolo Fault Zoning Act was passed in California. And basically, it says that you can't build structures intended for human habitation on the trace of an active fault, which seems very reasonable to me. So over here on the left, the little squares that you see in yellow, that's the coverage of the regulatory maps that were issued between 1974 and 2018. So we've done more since then, and we actually have another batch of Alquist-Priolo fault maps that are coming out next month. But that's not all that came out of the San Fernando earthquake. Oh, I wanted to show you this because it's relevant to you. So what does an Alquist-Priolo fault map look like? This is a little snippet of one. So all of these little areas, so here we are, right? Here's Point Loma, here's the Cabrillo National Monument down here. And all of these yellow areas with the black in there, that's the end of the Rose Canyon Fault. So those are active traces of that fault that are going through San Diego, near where we all know and love in Cabrillo. So the 1971 Silmar earthquake, or the San Fernando earthquake, also led to the establishment of the Strong Motion Instrumentation Program. Okay, so this is, I think it's just such a neat thing. This is a statewide set of seismic instruments that don't just measure the shaking of the ground, although we have 940 stations that measure that. It also measures shaking of buildings, bridges, dams, and other critical infrastructure. Okay, it looks at buildings by height. We look at buildings by type. We look at buildings in different representative geologic environments, on hard bedrock or in soft sands, because they respond differently. What does it actually look like? So we put instruments in this building. What are we hoping to capture? So this isn't a building in California, but this was a recent earthquake on the East Coast. So since it was recent, I thought I'd include it. There was a magnitude 4.8 in New Jersey. I actually felt it in Maryland, which was weird. But what we're going to see is an earthquake that's instrumented. And we want to be able to see how the building responds to an earthquake, number one, so that we can see if buildings have exceeded the amount of shaking that they were recommended to be able to withstand when they were built, but also so we can learn to build better buildings. So we're going to watch this building experience the earthquake, okay? It's important to recognize that the shaking in this case has been magnified 25,000 times. This is not a building made of jello. All right, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the building. And then on the right-hand side at the top, we're looking down the axis of the building. So looking at the building from above. On the bottom, what you're seeing, those squiggles, that's the measurement of the earthquake taken from the seismic instrument in the basement. So this is going to enable us to see how different parts of the building are moving at different times. So you can imagine how important this is for engineers and architects in order to be able to design better, safer buildings. Again, not a building made of jello. It's pretty wild, right? But we don't just instrument buildings, right? We also instrument things like bridges. So this is the Golden Gate Bridge. We have 111 seismic instruments on the Golden Gate Bridge measuring how the bridge responds to any kinds of shaking and vibration. What we're looking at now is an animation of the bridge response to the magnitude 6 South Napa earthquake that occurred on August 24th, 2014. So this is magnified only 500 times, and you can see the scale along the bottom. Now, I do want to note that the motion on the bridge was large enough that people were able to feel it. I got to be honest, y'all, watching this, I start to get a little seasick thinking about it. Okay. Most of the action is over, but it's California. Another day, it's another earthquake. This time we're going to go up to Northern California. It's 1989. It's another Tuesday, but this is not a random Tuesday. This is a really important Tuesday. It's quitting time and people are rushing home because it's the third game of the World Series. The Oakland A's are playing the San Francisco Giants in Candlestick Park and people are into it. So everybody's trying to get home when a magnitude 6.9 earthquake strikes. It occurred on the San Andreas Fault, and it resulted in 63 deaths and about $6 billion in damage. Okay, so if you look at the map over on the right-hand side, that little star is the epicenter of the earthquake. So that's where the earthquake started. These colors, again, are indicating the levels of shaking, and the areas in red and orange are the places that shook the hardest. So normally we would expect to see kind of a bullseye around the epicenter, but lots of things can influence what we feel during an earthquake. So the direction that the fault unzips in, because faults unzip kind of like zippers, that can impact where you feel the strongest shaking, but also the local rock and soil conditions make a lot of difference. And so this was one of those earthquakes where people really started to notice not just that the local rock and soil conditions are important, but also those secondary effects of earthquakes like liquefaction and earthquake-induced landslides. I do want to point out though, if you look across the Bay Area and if you look over near Oakland, see how there's those isolated pockets of heavier shaking? That is due to the local rock and soil in those places. Those are areas of soft, sandy, often marshy soil. And so they shake harder and for a longer period of time. That little blip over by Oakland is where the Nimitz Freeway collapsed. That's where a lot of the casualties were. So this recognition from this earthquake of the secondary effects of earthquakes and also the amplification effects of different types of soils led to passing the Seismic Hazards Mapping Act. So again, these little polygons are showing the areas where we have quads that we want to do and areas where we have quads that we have completed. What does that look like? So this is a map showing the LA area, and you can get all of these online. They're available through our EQ app. We call it the EQs app. But this is showing all of those different seismic hazards on one map. So over here on the left, you can see Santa Monica, there's Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, we've got Los Angeles. Up here in the mountains, the areas in blue, these are the areas that are susceptible to earthquake-induced landslides. Again, that's steep slopes, weak geologic materials, and the potential for moderate to strong earthquake shaking. The areas in green down here in the basin, those are areas that could be susceptible to liquefaction. So these are areas that have those soft sandy soils and a high water table. And the areas in yellow are the Alcos Priolo fault zones that show where there are traces of active faults that run through the area. And you can get really granular with this. We're going to zoom in a little bit to an area kind of over near Hollywood Boulevard. And I just picked a parcel at random. You click on any of these parcels and it gives you information about the hazards that that particular parcel of land could be subjected to. So all or a portion of this parcel lies within an earthquake fault zone. It is not within a liquefaction zone, but it does lie within a landslide zone. And so what this helps us to do is to mitigate against these hazards. So there's things that you can do structurally to your buildings or to the ground below it to keep it safe from these different seismic hazards. And that's the goal. We want to provide these maps to people, to policymakers, to homeowners, so that they can make informed decisions using science that will help to decrease their risk and increase their resiliency. But we also have tsunamis here, right? And so we have tsunami hazard area maps for evacuation planning. We have tsunami decision support playbook maps. And then we're hoping someday to have future tsunami zone and subzone maps under the Seismic Hazard Mapping Act. So you can see those maps as well. And I've pulled out a portion here that shows the Cabrillo area down there. The areas in yellow are the areas where we would recommend evacuation. So these are low-lying areas. The areas in green are high enough or far enough away from the coastline that they are not likely to be inundated during a tsunami event. So if you feel earthquake shaking, what you want to do is immediately, or if you receive an alert, drop, cover, and hold on. Drop down to the ground, take cover underneath a sturdy object like a table, and hold on until all the shaking has stopped. If you are near the coastline when that happens, immediately After the shaking has stopped, go to high ground or go inland. If you're on the coast and you feel long or prolonged earthquake shaking, that could be your natural tsunami warning. Again, go to high ground or go inland, and then stay there because tsunami waves can arrive for many hours. So we don't have to be scared of earthquakes. We just need to be prepared for them before they happen. So whether that is you in your home, whether that is people at work, whether that is our kids, our grandkids in their schools, whether that is, lawmakers and scientists, we have to make sure that we're all taking responsibility for the things within our control. So here's the 7 steps to earthquake safety. This is available from the Earthquake Country Alliance website. You secure your space, plan how you can be safe, create an emergency plan, organize your emergency supplies, do things to help minimize financial hardship, make sure you know the recommended action, which is drop, cover, and hold on. You improve your earthquake safety after the earthquake by cleaning up hazardous things, and then you reconnect with your community to help restore normal life. So if you don't have the MyShake app, that can be helpful because that can give you a few seconds of warning before earthquake shaking happens. So all of these different things we can do, using the science to make maps so that we can learn to mitigate hazards before they happen, learning how to secure our space, be safe, making sure that we have access to earthquake early alerts and that we know what to do when earthquake shaking happens. All of those things are going to help us to change the ending to our next earthquake story. Because if there's one thing we know, it's that California is earthquake country. And it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when.
Well, thank you, Wendy. On that terrifying note, no, I'm just kidding. I think it's interesting, right? Because, I've lived in California much of my life, and, I'm aware of earthquakes. I felt earthquakes. I'm as hopefully prepared for earthquakes. But I feel like when it comes to natural disasters in this country, to me, it's like they could happen at any time, which is both terrifying, but also, less terrifying than having a season like hurricane season in certain areas of the country, right? So I don't
That's
know.
funny because I'm
What's
from
that?
the East Coast. I'm used to hurricanes, and people on the East Coast are like, never would I ever move to California. There's earthquakes.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. Hurricanes, you can see them coming, so you can prepare ahead of time. And I'm like, earthquakes, we should prepare ahead of time too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it really is all a matter of perspective too, and what you're used to, and complacency as well. So I'm happy that we have organizations like yours who are helping us to prepare in advance, for these events, which are going to occur, right? We know it's, as you said, it's not a matter of if, but when. Well, folks, I want to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A for Wendy. We do have one question to start. And if you're thinking of other ones or even comments, let's go ahead and fire those up while I am asking the first one. So Eric would like to know, is it true that the geography of the underwater coastline just off of San Diego is less susceptible to tsunami impact?
That's a good question, and I don't know enough to say one way or another. We have a tsunami team that their entire careers are dedicated to that, so I can find out for you, but I don't know off the top of my head. What I can tell you is that the shape of the coastline is really important, and it also depends on where the tsunami is coming from. So a tsunami coming from Alaska, you can imagine would have sort of a different trajectory than a tsunami coming from, say, they're part of the Hawaiian Islands, God forbid, like slid off into the ocean along one of their big faults, and or there was a tsunami in South America, right? So a lot of it depends on where the tsunami is coming from, but the shape line and the bathymetry, the shape of the ocean, does make a difference. But I can find out for you.
Awesome. I would like to know that as well. So, Eric again would like to know, in your professional opinion, would you purchase earthquake insurance?
That's a good question. And I cannot give you my professional opinion on that. I can give you my personal opinion on that, which is it depends on where you are and it depends on your risk tolerance. So some people are more risk averse and would prefer to have things in place that help them sleep at night, right? I did not buy a house in California that was in even a moderate fire zone. I got as far away from fire as I could because I have no risk tolerance for that. Other people, that's fine. So a lot of it is about your risk tolerance, but there are a lot of tools out there that can help you to make those choices and can give you information about the level of risk where you live to your property and to your home. And a lot of that stuff is available on our website. If you go to the EQs app from the California Geological Survey website, you can find out what the hazards are near you.
Great answer, Wendy. Thank you. Sandy would like to know, she's made a comment that the overview map went by kind of quickly. And to her, it looked like Los Angeles was already mapped, but San Diego is in the to be done category. Is that true? And if so, is there a timeline for doing San Diego?
That's a good question. These maps take a really long time to make, and we've streamlined the process because we have such better tools now. ArcGIS, we have LiDAR. It's easier to map faults. It's easier to do the modeling than it used to be. And so we do have a timeline. We do have prioritization for areas that are more populated. So it really goes by like population level and the risk. So if you have a big active fault nearby, then we are far more likely to have mapped that area. So most of LA has been mapped, yes. Parts of San Diego have been mapped. Many of them are on the docket. Large parts of San Francisco have been mapped. We're just now releasing our very first liquefaction maps of Sacramento. So this is a new one for us here in Sacramento. That's never happened before. So they are coming.
Okay, thank you. Paula would like to know if you could put the like where
Yes.
they can find the app in the chat.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Now, I know a lot of folks have the app on here or, emergency alert on their phones, right? And so Eve was mentioning that she felt an earthquake warning on her phone or received an earthquake warning on her phone after she felt the earthquake, but then she felt another one, like an aftershock. Can you explain kind of how those alerts work and
Absolutely.
what to expect there?
So the way that they work, after an earthquake starts, right, the waves travel at a certain speed. And the closest seismometers, the three closest seismometers, once they have detected shaking above a certain threshold, three of them, they send basically data to the data center that an alert needs to go out. And then the alert is issued based on where you are. And sometimes you even get a countdown to when it's coming. You get an estimated magnitude. All of that happens really quickly. And so if you are really close to the epicenter of that earthquake, there's not time for the sensors to feel it, send the data, and then that to come to your phone, right? Because you're essentially feeling it at the same time that the seismometers are feeling it. But for people that are farther away, that can give them seconds or tens of seconds of warning. So if you are feeling shaking before you're getting an alert, the chances that you're really close to where the earthquake started. And people will say, like, what difference does a couple of seconds make? It matters if you're getting LASIK eye surgery. New fear unlocked. You're welcome. It matters if you're at the dentist or if you're in an elevator or if you're at, say, Home Depot, right? It gives you time to get to somewhere safe. And it also does things like automatic things with infrastructure, like slow down trails to prevent derailments. It will automatically open firehouse doors so that they don't get jammed shut with the emergency response equipment trapped inside. So there's other things that go along with the earthquake early warnings, in addition to the alerts that we get. And so you felt what you may have felt, it could be two things, right? So I'm about to get into the science. I'm sorry if I'm going to get a little nerdy on you, but the earthquake waves travel at different they travel at different speeds. So the fastest wave is called the P wave, and it's a push-pull wave. So that's the first one you feel, and usually you'll feel it as a jolt. And then there'll be, depending on how far away you are, because they need time to like spread out because one travels more slowly, like thunder and lightning, right? If you're close, you see the flash and hear the sound right away. But if you're further away, you see the flash and it takes a minute. So it's like the P wave arrives and then the S waves arrive. And that's like where you feel a lot of the shaking, the back and forth shaking. Those are the S waves. And so it may be that you were close to the earthquake and then you felt an aftershock, Or it could be that you felt the P wave arrive and then you felt the S waves arrive. Hard to say, not knowing exactly where you were, but it could be either of those because there were some felt aftershocks. It was actually the first earthquake my kids ever felt because they were in San Diego visiting their grandparents. So they were stoked.
That's cool. They were stoked. Yeah,
After hearing about it their whole life.
Exactly. That's a great perspective to have, like, oh, this cool thing I'm experiencing instead of sheer terror. Uh, so I would like to know, are there any myths, earthquake myths out there that you have heard that drive you crazy and you would like to debunk? Now is your time.
Thank you. I don't even know where to start. California will not fall off into the ocean. The ocean is not just a big hole things fall into, right? What's actually happening is all of the land that's on the Pacific plate, so everything to the west of essentially the San Andreas Fault, is moving up towards Alaska at about the rate that your fingernails grow. So it's just moving along. It's not going to fall off. There is no such thing as earthquake weather. Earthquakes start miles below the surface of the earth, and so they're not really impacted by much of the things that are happening up here, including the weather. What ends up happening is that our human brains love patterns, right? We make pictures in the stars. There's not really a bear up there. We just like to say that, right? And so we do the same thing. And the most memorable earthquake in any particular culture is usually the one that they associate with whatever weather was happening at the time. So Northridge, it was kind of hot and dry. So for a long time, people thought that was earthquake weather. There have been earthquakes in other places where it was unseasonably cool and wet. And so in those areas, they associate that with earthquake weather, but really it doesn't matter. No one can predict earthquakes. No one. Anyone who says differently is selling something. We can forecast earthquakes, which is different. Like you can say things like there'll be an earthquake in California today. Of course there will. There's an earthquake every day. Just like I can say there will be rain in Kauai today because there's rain in Kauai every day. But that's not really prediction because it happens all the time. So it's not really meaningful. So in order for a prediction to be a real prediction, it has to be meaningful. It has to be within a small enough space that you can't say like, there's going to be a big earthquake on the West Coast in the next 10 years. Like, come on. And it has to be something that doesn't happen randomly. So nobody can predict earthquakes, but we can give you long-term forecasts of what to expect. And when I say long-term, I'm talking 30 years.
Okay. Well, this is the perfect time to ask this question that Scott just asked. Is the San Andreas Fault 27 months pregnant?
The idea of faults being overdue is one that I would like to kind of do away with, right? It's not, they're not pregnant. It's not a bill. It's not a chemistry test that you're late on. It's just that we think earthquakes behave or faults behave in a particular way. I don't know that we're right that they behave that way. And when we are learning, so I have to explain how we know how often earthquakes happen there, right? Because we're talking about geologic time. And so how do you do that? We dig down inside the fault and we look at the layers of the ground that have been moved and displaced by past earthquakes. And then we use things like C14 dating and other methods to figure out about when that happened. But there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty in our interpretation. There's uncertainty in the techniques that we use to measure the times. There's uncertainty in the system, right? So like we can say that we have hurricanes every year, but the time when the first hurricane forms is different. And so we can't even forecast that, right, appropriately. And now we're talking about earthquakes that only happen once every 500 years, 300 years, 1,000 years. So there's a lot of uncertainty involved. So when we say there's an earthquake on the southern San Andreas every 300 years and it's been 320 years, it's like, give or take 100 years. And so part of it is a geologic time problem. What we do know is that stress and strain are building up, and we know the places that haven't had earthquakes in a long time. So the places that haven't had earthquakes in a long time, especially when we know stress and strain is building up quickly, those are the places we're most worried about. One of those places is the southern San Andreas Fault. It's been a long time. It's moving really quickly. Eventually it's going to happen. We don't know exactly when, but we know it should be coming. And it's more likely than, say, an earthquake on a fault that more recently had an earthquake or that is moving more slowly, if that makes sense.
Kind of like Yellowstone blowing
Yes.
eventually. Hopefully not in our lifetime.
No.
Yeah, interesting. I love that. Is California, do we have like the most active fault zones in the world? Or do we have the biggest earthquakes in the world?
No.
Where
Thank
is that
goodness.
place?
Well, it sort of depends. So Japan has more than 100,000 recorded earthquakes every year, and they feel earthquakes regularly. And the largest earthquakes in the world happen along subduction zones. That's where one plate is diving down underneath another plate. So that's like the Cascadia subduction zone that runs along Oregon, Washington, and northern part of California. Japan has a couple of subduction zones. Indonesia, the whole thing is on a subduction zone. Tonga, that all of those islands, the Solomon's Islands, Tonga, Fiji, they have earthquakes, magnitude 7s there all the time, like every year. Alaska is the state that has the most earthquakes. They have tons of faults. So anywhere along the plate boundaries are going to have a lot of faults. Most of the faults that we have, at least on land in California, are strike slip faults and reverse faults. So we don't have any of those really sort of deep faults that can create these really large earthquakes. But hey, a magnitude 7 is nothing to shake a stick at, you guys. Like that, especially under an urban area. Whew, no, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt it. I don't recommend. Question as a conservation biologist, question about fracking. Can fracking cause earthquakes? I know that this is something that has been in the media a lot lately. What's your take on that?
So yeah, fracking can cause earthquakes. This is a known thing. Sorry, I'm trying to stay out of the sun, which is like moving. It's near the horizon, so it's like keeps moving. So fracking is hydraulic fracturing, and that's where companies that are looking to extract hydrocarbons will take water and a slurry of material and inject it down into the ground with the aim of fracturing the rocks, breaking them up to help get out the oil or natural gas or whatever it is that they're interested in. That can cause small earthquakes. You're breaking rocks, and essentially that's an earthquake. The problem is when that gets, and fracking can cause small earthquakes. I'm not trying to discount that. When you pull all of that stuff back out, now you have all of that water and slurry. It's called wastewater, and you have to do something with it. And so this isn't so much a California problem. Let's move over to the Midwest. Let's talk about Oklahoma, say. They have a lot of fracking that happens, and then they have a lot of wastewater injection. So they'll drill down really deep below aquifers, below anything that impacts us here on the surface or things that we use in the subsurface. And they'll inject that water down because the earth can act like a giant sort of sieve and clean things up. Problem is when you inject water into places where you may have faults, you can lubricate those faults, or you can change the subsurface stress field enough that it can cause earthquakes. And so those wastewater injection earthquakes are actually the ones that are the largest and most damaging. So there was a magnitude 5.7, 5.8 earthquake in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 2016 that actually caused significant damage. And there was a period of time where Oklahoma had more magnitude 3 earthquakes than California because of wastewater injection.
Wow. Wow, that's
not
shocking.
Normal.
No, definitely not. When you think earthquakes, I'm not thinking Oklahoma.
No, because they're in the middle of the plate, right? They're not on the plate boundary. And we do have earthquakes. I'm doing a series on earthquakes in all 50 states that talks about earthquakes all across the United States. But like, that's not normal. They're not on a plate boundary. That shouldn't be happening.
That is crazy. Let's see. I'm going to go with a last little bit of question here before we log off for the evening, because I don't see any other in the Q&A. This is your last chance. If you have a burning question or you thought of one as we're chatting, please put it in the Q&A and we'll get it to it last. But, I look at the world through a conservation lens, being a conservation biologist. And so I want to ask you, can you think of a reason why earthquakes could be a good thing? Are there good reasons for earthquakes? What are they?
Everybody, look out your window. Do you see mountains? Is there
Hmm.
topography? That is because of earthquakes. So in most places, especially in the West, if you see a mountain range, there is a fault at the bottom of that mountain range that has lifted those mountains, created those ecosystems, allowed this beautiful place where we live and work and thrive, where we have built homes and communities, where we have our animal friends that are, in these spaces. That's all because of geology and tectonics. The world exists as we know it by geologic consent, which can be revoked at any time. But the world that you see outside your window is largely because of earthquakes. And that's the process of an active Earth. If the Earth was not active, if we didn't have plate tectonics, we wouldn't have the world that we have with all of its rich life and diversity. And so they can be pesky and problematic, but it's something that we can live with, right? We humans are smart and we have ingenuity and we can solve hard problems. So this is just another problem to be solved. We need to learn to live with earthquakes because they've created these beautiful places for us.
I love that, Wendy. Thank you. And in fact, the Rose Canyon Fault created the Point Loma Peninsula, where Carrillo National Monument is located, that beautiful national park that we all love, right? That used to be at the bottom of the ocean, and now it's a peninsula that we can go and enjoy. And Scott was saying he literally sees the Rose Canyon Fault from his house, which is pretty incredible.
Oh,
And there is two more questions. People thought of two more questions as we were chatting, and then we'll log
mhm.
off. Eric, I'm going to get to your question last. So let's ask Williams first. Is the Salton Sea a rift fault too?
So the Salton Sea is actually made up of lots of different faults that are helping to accommodate that spreading. So yes, it is rifting, pulling apart. It's kind of the extension of the Gulf of California up into California. And it's a really fascinating transition zone, right? You have the Brawley seismic zone down there. It's always having swarms. You've got lots of geothermal activity. You have the San Andreas Fault, which officially starts halfway down the Salton Sea on the northern side at Bombay Beach. And then you have all of these sort of transform faults that run underneath of the Salton Sea that are helping to accommodate that stretching as it's pulling apart. So yes.
It's a fascinating area for biologically as well, the
Oh
Salton
yeah.
Sea. I
We should
recommend
go.
everybody should visit it. I know,
Field trip.
absolutely. Let's go nerd out together. I'm into it. Okay, and then we're going to end tonight with this question from Eric, which I don't know the answer to, and I'm excited to hear the response. So Eric would like to know, are tectonics only found on Earth?
Oh, I love that question. No, they are found on other planets, including Venus. So we have a new scientist that works at CGS that was working on the tectonics of Venus, which I have not had an opportunity to learn as much about as I would like. Their tectonics are not like our tectonics, though. It's a very different system, very different
Hmm.
time frame. But it's really interesting, right? Because one of the things that goes along with this is studying kind of the geophysics of other planets because we use
Mhm.
earthquakes. That's how we understand what's inside the earth is by using earthquake waves and ingenuity. And so NASA put a seismometer on Mars. It was the NASA InSight mission, partially to measure Mars quakes because they're not going to be earthquakes on Mars, right? They're Mars quakes, but also to use the seismic waves from any Mars quakes as well as any impacts to understand the structure of Mars. And you guys, we were very wrong about what we thought Mars was like on the inside. And there's nothing greater when you're a scientist than being like wrong about something where you made an educated guess because you're like, this is so exciting. What new can I learn from this? What can it teach me? And so it turns out that Mars actually has quakes, and some of them are quite large. Some of them may be related to the movement of, half solid material under the surface. Some of them are related to expansion and contraction from the changes in temperature. So there's lots of stuff, and there's other planetoids, planets, moons that have sort of tectonics too, although it may be an icy body and not a rocky body. So fascinating ways that our solar system can work to accommodate changes in temperature and gradients and stresses. Man, the universe is so cool.
It is. And there's always more to learn, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's the beauty of it. You answer one question and 40 other questions open up. Yeah, so cool. Well, Wendy, this was a delight. Thank you so much for coming in and talking about earthquakes with us and helping us be safer. I'm going to allay some of those fears. And we've got some people saying this was so interesting. Thank you, and agree.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
in the chat. And great talk. Thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I have one last thing I do want to share, and that is a thank you to our sponsors, which also has information on the next talk. So we'd like to thank the Cabrillo National Monument Foundation. You can go to their website at cnmf.org and thank them yourself. And we've got our next Naturally Speaking. We're taking a break in May, but we'll be back in June on climate change and coastal communities with Dr. Kimberly Rain Miner. And this is going to be a really good one on the 24th of June. So learn about how climate change is affecting San Diego and Cabrillo National Monument in particular. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. I'll see you next time. Have a great night. Bye. Bye, everyone.